Hello, welcome back. This is John Owen, The Mortification of Sin, and this is Chapter 4. The last principle of the usefulness of mortification. The vigor and comfort of our spiritual lives depend on our mortification. In what sense? Not absolutely and necessarily. Psalm 50, 60, 70, 80, 5, 6, 7. Psalm 87. Heman's condition, not as on the next and immediate cause, as a means, by removing of the contrary. The desperate effects of any unmortified lust, it weakens the soul, Psalm 37, 3 and 8, sundry ways and darkens it. All graces improved by the mortification of sin, the best evidence of sincerity. That's the summary of the chapter. I think that it's interesting that he gives a little bullet point kind of teaser. I don't usually get a whole lot. I think my brain was kind of like on autopilot reading through that whole thing. So I don't even know what this chapter is about after reading that. But I think it's interesting because in my line of work as a freelance writer, I typically write a little teaser bullet point sort of like contained in this course is you're going to find, X, Y, and Z, and I sort of give little suspense or teaser sorts of things. So kind of does, it's like he's already using that principle to kind of get people, give people a little preview of what's coming. My interest in this chapter is we've been through 3 chapters, and he's kind of gone through, chapter 1 was a summary and overview of these 3 principles, and then chapter 2 was principle 1, chapter 3 was principle 2, chapter 4 looks like the last principle that he's going to insist on. And so the 3 principles that he has covered so far, which then he's gonna, I think, dive into more deeply. Principle 1, that the choicest believers who are assuredly freed from the condemning power of sin ought yet to make it their business all their days to mortify the indwelling power of sin. The second point was, he only is sufficient for this work. In other words, the Spirit. He, the Spirit, only is sufficient for this work. All ways and means without him are as a thing of naught, and he is the great efficient of it. He works in us as he pleases. And then in this chapter, the principle is point 3, that the life, vigor, and comfort of our spiritual life depend much on our mortification of sin. Now, this I realize is sort of laying the groundwork, laying the preliminary pieces, starting to get us warmed up to unpack the topic at a deeper level and sort of set the pillars or the foundation pieces of these 3 points. What I am interested in is I'm sort of scanning for what are we supposed to do. So I feel like what we have been through up until this point, and probably this chapter as well, is things to know, and then we will get to things to do. So when we get to things to do, I think that it will be important to implement those things and start to do them. I think we've seen a few things to do, or seen the implication of a few things to do. For instance, point 1, the choicest believers who are assuredly freed from the condemning power of sin ought yet to make it their business all their days to mortify the indwelling power of sin. So it's, what to do in that is you should mortify sin, mortify the indwelling power of sin. And I think the question that arises is, well, how do we do that? What does that mean that I'm doing? If I saw a video of myself mortifying the indwelling power of sin, what would I be seeing myself doing and saying and feeling and acting on? I don't really actually know. That's why I'm reading this book. And so that one has sort of a point that we need unpacked a little bit in order to know what to do, but at least at minimum, I think we can set ourselves with the intention and the purpose and the definite sort of purposeful intentionality of, okay, I'm after you, sin, indwelling sin. You're not going to be left alone in me. And once I find out what that means, I'm going to be implementing that. I think in chapter 3, where it was point 2, we also saw sort of an implied thing to do, which the point was that only the Spirit is sufficient for this work. So that's something to know and get our heads right and get our thinking right and get our beliefs right. But then what to do about that is to believe and to trust and to receive by faith the grace of the Spirit, the Spirit's work. Invite the Spirit in to do the work and not be working in our own strength. So now we come to chapter 4, and I will just be looking for what is it that I need to know, and then what is it that I need to do out of this chapter. Here we go. The last principle I shall insist on, omitting first the necessity of mortification unto life, and secondly, the certainty of life upon mortification, is, point 3, that the life, vigor, and comfort of our spiritual life depend much on our mortification of sin. Strength and comfort and power and peace in our walking with God are the things of our desires. That's an interesting way of saying we all want strength and comfort and power and peace when we walk with God. And that's true, don't we? Who wants to be weak and uncomfortable and have no power, like powerless, and no peace, like always kind of combative and battling? Nobody wants that. So yeah, we all can agree that this is what we all want. Strength and comfort and power and peace in our walking with God are the things of our desires. Were any of us asked seriously, what is it that troubles us? We must refer it to one of these heads. Either we want strength or power, vigor and life in our obedience, in our walking with God, or we want peace, comfort, and consolation therein. Whatever it is that may befall a believer that does not belong to one of these two heads does not deserve to be mentioned in the days of our complaints. That's an interesting topic. It makes me want to think, well, is there another category? If any of my troubles, or do all of my troubles go up to one of those heads? Either strength and power is missing, or peace and comfort and consolation is missing? Maybe so. Now, all these do much depend on a constant course of mortification, concerning which observe. 1. I do not say they proceed from it, as though they were necessarily tied to it. A man may be carried on in a constant course of mortification all his days, and yet perhaps never enjoy a good day of peace and consolation. So it was with Heman, Psalm 87. His life was a life of perpetual mortification and walking with God, yet terrors and wounds were his portion all his days. But God singled out Heman, a choice friend, to make him an example to them that afterward should be in distress. Canst thou complain if it be no otherwise with thee than it was with Heman, that eminent servant of God? And this shall be his praise to the end of the world. God makes it his prerogative to speak peace and consolation. God makes it his prerogative to speak peace and consolation. Isaiah 57, 18 and 19. I will do that work, says God. I will comfort him, verse 18. But how? By an immediate work of the new creation. I create it, says God. The use of means for the obtaining of peace is ours. The bestowing of it is God's prerogative. That's an interesting point. Basically, he's saying, just because mortification of sin is necessary to us obtaining peace and strength, it doesn't mean that we'll necessarily get it. It just means that, so we could mortify sin all our days and not have peace and strength. But if we are going to have peace and strength, we have to have mortification of sin first. And it's God's prerogative. It's up to God. God can withhold or he can grant the peace and comfort and strength and power that we want. In the ways, point 2, in the ways instituted by God for us to give, 2, in the ways instituted by God for to give us life, vigor, courage, and consolation, Mortification is not one of the immediate causes of it. They are the privileges of our adoption made known to our souls that give us immediately these things. The Spirit bearing witness with our spirits that we are the children of God, giving us a new name and a white stone, adoption and justification, that is, as to the sense and knowledge of them, are the immediate causes in the hand of the Spirit of these things. But this I say, 3. In our ordinary walking with God, and in an ordinary course of his dealing with us, the vigor and comfort of our spiritual lives depend much on our mortification, not only as a causa sine qua non, but as a thing that hath an effectual influence therein too. So what is he saying? Point 1 and 2, we might mortify sin and not get the comfort and vigor of our spiritual lives, but ordinarily, point 3, in our ordinary walking with God, the vigor and comfort of our spiritual lives do depend on our mortification. So if we're not mortifying sin, we cannot expect to have much vigor and much comfort. Not only as a causa sine qua non, which that Latin phrase, I'm not really coming up with anything but a blank in my mind for what that means, even though I've heard people use that before. But, oh well. But as a thing that hath an effectual influence therein too. In other words, our mortification does influence our vigor and comfort ordinarily. I'm going to just read point 3 again. 3. In our ordinary walking with God, and in an ordinary course of his dealing with us, the vigor and comfort of our spiritual lives depend much on our mortification, not only as a causa sine qua non, but as a thing that hath an effectual influence thereunto. 4. 1. This alone keeps sin from depriving us of the one and the other. Every unmortified sin will certainly do two things. First, it will weaken the soul and deprive it of its vigor. 2, it will darken the soul and deprive it of its comfort and peace. 1. It weakens the soul and deprives it of its strength. When David had for a while harbored an unmortified lust in his heart, it broke all his bones and left him no spiritual strength. Hence he complained that he was sick, weak, wounded, faint. There is, saith he, no soundness in me. Psalm 38:3. I am feeble and sore broken. Verse 8. Yea, I cannot so much as look up. Psalm 60:12. No, Psalm 40:12. An unmortified lust will drink up the spirit and all the vigor of the soul and weaken it for all duties. 4. First, it untunes and unframes the heart itself by entangling its affections. It diverts the heart from the spiritual frame that is required for vigorous communion with God. It lays hold on the affections, rendering its object beloved and desirable, so expelling the love of the Father, 1 John 2:15 and 3:17, so that the soul cannot say uprightly and truly to God, Thou art my portion, having something else that it loves. Fear, desire, hope, which are the choice affections of the soul that should be full of God, will be one way or other entangled with it. Secondly, it fills the thoughts with contrivances about it. Thoughts are the great purveyors of the soul to bring in provision to satisfy its affections, and if sin remain unmortified in the heart, they must ever and anon be making provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. They must gaze, adorn, and dress the objects of the flesh, and bring them home to give satisfaction. And this they are able to do in the service of a defiled imagination beyond all expression. Thirdly, it breaks out and actually hinders duty. The ambitious man must be studying, and the worldling must be working or contriving, and the sensual, vain person providing himself for vanity, when they should be engaged in the worship of God. Were this my present business, to set forth the breaches, ruin, weakness, desolations that one unmortified lust will bring upon a soul, this discourse must be extended much beyond my intendment. But he gave us 3 points there that I think are really good symptoms to notice. If our heart is weakened, untuned, and unframed, and the affections of the heart are not centered in God, if our soul is not genuinely delighting in God as thou art my portion, that's an indication that sin may have deprived us of that close communion with God. Second, if our thoughts are all over the map, if our thoughts and imaginations are, what did he say, defiled and lustful and filled with things that are ungodly, or we're just thinking about things that are not of the Lord, that could be another symptom that indicates to us like, uh-oh, hey, look, your unmortified sin is producing these thoughts, so let's go after the unmortified sin. And thirdly, duty. If you're not fulfilling your duty, if you're not walking in the things that you know to do, if you know what to do but you're not doing it, and it's just, your actions are not consistent with what you would want them to be, that could be another evidence of unmortified sin. And then those unmortified sins are going to deprive you of your strength and comfort. And then he just says, if I was going to go through all of the list of all of the things that one unmortified lust can do to bring breaches, ruin, weakness, and desolation to your soul, this book would be a lot longer, so he's just going to move on. Anyway, that was under point 1, that every unmortified sin will certainly weaken the soul. And now here's point 2, every unmortified sin will certainly darken the soul and deprive it of its comfort and peace. 2, as sin weakens, so it darkens the soul. It is a cloud, a thick cloud, that spreads itself over the face of the soul and intercepts all the beams of God's love and favor. It takes away all sense of the privilege of our adoption, and if the soul begins to gather up thoughts of consolation, sin quickly scatters them, of which afterward. Now, in this regard, the vigor and power of our spiritual life depend on our mortification. It is the only means of the removal of that which will allow us neither the one nor the other. Men that are sick and wounded under the power of lust make many applications for help. They cry to God when the perplexity of their thoughts overwhelms them. Even to God do they cry, but are not delivered. In vain do they use many remedies. They shall not be healed. So Hosea 5:13. Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, and attempted sundry remedies. Nothing will do until they come, verse 15, to acknowledge their offense. Men may see their sickness and wounds, but yet if they make not due applications, their cure will not be effected. 2. This is the second subpoint under the main point 3 of this chapter. So just keeping in mind the outline, number 3, he had said, in our ordinary walking with God, and in an ordinary course of his dealing with us, the vigor and comfort of our spiritual lives depend much on our mortification, not only as a causa sine qua non, but as a thing that hath an effectual influence thereunto. For, number 1, this alone keeps sin from depriving us of the one and the other, and we went through that in several points. And then now number 2, mortification prunes all the graces of God and makes room for them in our hearts to grow. The life and vigor of our spiritual lives consists in the vigor and flourishing of the plants of grace in our hearts. Now, as you may see in a garden, let there be a precious herb planted, and let the ground be untilled, and weeds grow about it. Perhaps it will live still, but be a poor, withering, unuseful thing. I have this going on in my garden right now. I have 2 zucchini plants and 2 yellow squash plants and 2 butternut squash plants that are just sort of yellow and spindly and not thriving. And it's July right now. It's July 14th. And this time last year, I had like big, bushy, dark green zucchini plants that were making, I mean, I probably got 100 pounds of zucchini last year out of 3 zucchini plants. And now this year, what happened was I had all these lamb's quarters, which is sort of a weed, but it's also super nutritious. So I let them grow, but they grew up really tall and they're shading out the light from my zucchini. So my zucchinis are sort of surrounded by weeds. They're not being taken care of. I'm depriving myself of the fruits of zucchini and yellow squash by letting the lamb's quarters grow. And I really have too many lamb's quarters growing in the garden. And I let them grow because I was like, oh, this is super nutritious. I'll make them into a bunch of salads. But then I haven't harvested nearly as many as I grew. So they're just crowding out my zucchinis. So I need to just cut all those lamb's quarters down and make room for my zucchini and my yellow squash and my butternut squash so that they can grow. And then I'll expect to get fruit. I don't expect to get any fruit from my zucchini right now because my zucchini is basically just not getting the conditions that it needs to grow. So he's saying, you know, if you have a precious herb planted in a garden and the ground is untilled and the weeds are growing about it, perhaps it will live still, but it will be a poor, withering, unuseful thing. And what is the use of a zucchini plant that doesn't make any zucchini? It's just, you know, cumbering the ground. You must look and search for it, and sometimes can scarce find it. And when you do, you can scarce know it, whether it be the plant you look for or no. And suppose it be, you can make no use of it at all. When, let another of the same kind be set in the ground, naturally as barren and bad as the other, but let it be well weeded, and everything that is noxious and hurtful removed from it. It flourishes and thrives. You may see it at first. Look into the garden, and have it for your use when you please. So it is with the graces of the Spirit that are planted in our hearts. That is true. They are still. They abide in a heart where there is some neglect of mortification, but they are ready to die. Revelation 3:2. They are withering and decaying. The heart is like the sluggard's field, so overgrown with weeds that you can scarce see the good corn. Such a man may search for faith, love, and zeal, and scarce be able to find any. And if he do discover that these graces are there yet alive and sincere, yet they are so weak, so clogged with lusts, that they are of very little use. They remain indeed, but are ready to die. But now let the heart be cleansed. Sorry, my brain tuned out. Let me just back up. The heart is like the sluggard's field, so overgrown with weeds that you can scarce see the good corn. Such a man may search for faith, love, and zeal, and scarce be able to find any. And if he do discover that these graces are there, yet alive and sincere, yet they are so weak, so clogged with lusts, that they are of very little use. They remain indeed, but are ready to die. But now let the heart be cleansed by mortification, the weeds of lust constantly and daily rooted up. As they spring daily, nature being their proper soil, let room be made for grace to thrive and flourish. How will every grace act its part and be ready for every use and purpose? There's an action for us. Weed your garden. Pull up your weeds. When you have weeds coming up in your soul, they're going to crowd out your graces and make it so that it's harder to find the good things that are there, but they're just so crowded out and not thriving. 3. As to our peace, as there is nothing that hath any evidence of sincerity without it, so I know nothing that hath such an evidence of sincerity in it, which is no small foundation of our peace. I have no idea what he just meant there. 3. As to our peace, so this is the third point after the third main point, which is with the comfort of in an ordinary course of our walking with God, the comfort of our spiritual lives, the vigor and comfort of our spiritual lives depend much on our mortification. And this is because, first, this alone keeps sin from depriving us of both vigor and comfort. Second, when we mortify our sin, it prunes all the graces of God and makes room for them in our hearts to grow like a weeded garden. And then 3, as to our peace, as there is nothing that hath any evidence of sincerity without it. So there's nothing, if we don't have peace, then we don't have evidence of our sincerity, maybe? As there is nothing that hath any evidence of sincerity without it, so I know nothing that hath such an evidence of sincerity in it, which is no small foundation of our peace. I think that he's saying that there's nothing that we do gives us evidence of our sincerity in walking with God without peace. Okay, without peace, we don't have any evidence of sincerity. With peace, there is nothing that has such an evidence of sincerity in it. So if you do have peace about your life, then that's a really good evidence of sincerity. I guess that's what he's saying, which is no small foundation of our peace. I don't know what the antecedent of it is. Maybe the antecedent of it is not peace, because then it would be circular for him to go on to say, which is no small foundation of our peace. So maybe the antecedent of it is unmortified sin or mortification. Let's say that it means mortification. Okay, so let's say that he means, as to our peace, as there is nothing that hath any evidence of sincerity without mortification, so I know nothing that hath such an evidence of sincerity in mortification. I don't know if that makes any sense. Anyway, the sentence is this. Point 3. As to our peace, as there is nothing that hath any evidence of sincerity without it, so I know nothing that hath such an evidence of sincerity in it, which is no small foundation of our peace. Mortification is the soul's vigorous opposition to self, wherein sincerity is most evident. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for joining me.